Chapter 9.
Augustus was on the front porch biding his time when Wilbarger rode up. Biding his time seemed to him the friendly thing to do, insomuch as Jake Spoon had ridden a long way and had likely been scared to seek out womankind during his trip. Jake was one of those men who seemed to stay in rut the year round, a great source of annoyance to Call, who was never visibly in rut. Augustus was subject to it, but as he often said, he wasn't going to let it drive him like a mule. A low joke that still went over the heads of most of the people who heard it. He enjoyed a root, as he called it, but if conditions weren't favorable, could make do with whiskey for lengthy spells. It was clear that with Jake just back, conditions weren't too favorable that afternoon, so he repaired to his jug with the neighborly intention of giving Jake an hour or two to whittle down his needs before he followed along and tried to interest him in a card game. Wilbarger, of course, was a surprise. He trotted his big black horse right up to the porch, which surprised the blue pigs as much as it did Augustus. They woke up and grunted at the horse. Wilbarger looked enviously at Augustus's jug. By God, I bet that ain't persimmon juice you're drinking. I wish I could afford an easy life. If you was to dismount and stop scaring my pigs, you'd be welcome to a drink, Augustus said. We can introduce ourselves later. The shote got up and walked right underneath the black horse, which was well broke enough that it didn't move. Wilbarger was more shocked than the horse. In fact, Augustus was shocked himself. The shote had never done such a thing before, though he had always been an unpredictable shote. I guess that's one of the pigs you don't rent, Wilbarger said. If I'd have been riding my mare, she'd have kicked it so far you'd have had to hunt to find your bacon. Well, that pig had been asleep, Augustus said. I guess it didn't expect a horse to be standing there when it woke up. Which are you, Call or McCrae? Wilbarger asked, tired of discussing the pigs. I'm McCrae, Augustus said. Call wouldn't put up with this much jabbering. Can't blame him. I'm Wilbarger. At that moment, Call stepped out of the house. In fact, his bite had pained him all day, and he had been in the process of making himself a poultice of cactus pulp. It took a while to make, which is why he had come in early. As he came out on the porch, a small man on a gray came riding around the house. Why, hell, you had us surrounded and we didn't even know it, Augustus said. This is Captain Call, standing here with his shirt tail out. I'm Wilbarger. This is my man, Chick. You're free to get down, Call said. Oh, well, Wilbarger said. Why get down when I would soon just have to climb back up? It's unnecessary labor. I hear you men trade horses. We do, Call said. Cattle, too. Don't bother me about cattle, Wilbarger said. I got 3,000 head ready to start up the trail. What I need is a remuda.
It's fine looking at him.
And it's a pity that cattle can't be trained to carry riders, Augustus said. The thought had just occurred to him, so following his habit, he put it at once into speech. Both Call and Wilbarger looked at him as if he were daft. You may think it a pity, Wilbarger said. I can call it a blessing. I suppose you wrote that sign? That's right, Augustus said. Want me to write you one? No, I ain't ready for a sanatorium yet, Wilbarger said. Never expected to meet Latin in this part of Texas, but I guess education has spread. How'd you round up that much stock without horses, Call asked, hoping to get the conversation back around to business. Oh, well, I just trained a bunch of jackrabbits to chase them out of the brush, Wilbarger said, a bit testy. In fact, some darn Mexicans stole our horses, he added. I had heard you men hung all the Mexican horse thieves when you were rangers, but I guess you missed a few. Ah, hell, we hung every one of them, Augustus said, glad to see that their visitor was of an argumentative temper. It must be a new generation that stole your nags. We ain't responsible for them. This is idle talk, Wilbarger said. I happen to be responsible for 3,000 cattle and 11 men. If I could buy 40 horses, good horses, I'd feel happier. Can you oblige me? We expect to have 100 head available at sunup tomorrow, Call said. Gus's talkativeness had one advantage. It often gained him a minute or two in which to formulate plans. I had no intention of spending the night here, Wilbarger said. Anyway, I don't need 100 head, or 50 either. How many could I get this afternoon? Augustus dug out his old brass pocket watch and squinted at it. Oh, we couldn't sell horses now, he said. We're closed for the day. Wilbarger abruptly dismounted and automatically loosened his horse's girth a notch or two to give him an easier breathe. I never expected to hear talk like this, he said. I never heard of a livery stable closing in bright daylight. Oh, the stable don't close, Augustus said. We can stable anything you want us to. It's just the horse trading part of the operation that's closed. Wilbarger walked up to the porch. That jug's for rent, I'll rent a swig, he said. I guess that jug's about the only thing that's still open in this town. It's open and it's free, Augustus said, handing it to him. While Wilbarger was drinking, Augustus looked at Call. The remark about the 100 horses had struck him as bold talk, even if they were planning a swing through Mexico. Their main object on recent swings had been cattle. Now and again, they ran into a few horses and threw them in with the cattle, seldom more than 10 or 12 in one night. Where the other 90 were to come from, Augustus didn't know. Ain't there a whore in this town? Chick asked. He was still horseback. The remark took everybody by surprise. Wilbarger seemed quite displeased with it. Chick, I thought you had a few manners, he said. Talking that kind of talk down at the lots is one thing. Talking it up here when I'm trying to discuss business with these gentlemen is something else. Well, them boys at the lots wouldn't tell me, Chick said, with a touch of a whine. That's because they're God-fearing boys, Augustus said. You wouldn't catch them boys with no Jezebel. Is that her name? Chick asked. It ain't the name I heard. He's never learned to curb his passions, Wilbarger said. I hope you'll excuse him. A loose tongue is never welcome, Augustus said mildly. Horses, Wilbarger said, returning to the more important subject. This business about being closed is an irritation. I'd hoped to be back at my herd by sunup. It's held in a bad place. The mosquitoes will eat most of my crew if I don't hurry. And if I could just get enough ponies to get me started, I might be able to pick up some extras as I go north. That's a risk, Call said. I know it's a risk. What ain't? Wilbarger said. How many could you sell me this afternoon? Call was tired of beating around the bush. 3, he said. 3 this afternoon and 100 tomorrow? Wilbarger said. You must know a man with lots of horses to sell. I wish I knew him. He mostly sells to us, Augustus said. We're lavish with money. Wilbarger handed back the jug. You're lavish with time, too, he said. My time. We couldn't go to visit this man right now, could we? Call shook his head. Sunup, he said. Wilbarger nodded, as if that was what he had expected. All right, he said. If you left me a choice, I don't notice it. He walked back to the black horse, tightened the girth, and pulled himself back into the saddle. You men won't disappoint me, will you? He asked. I'm mean as a tom turkey when I'm disappointed. We've always been taken at our word, Call said. You can count on 40 horses at sunup. $35 a horse. We'll be here, Wilbarger said. You won't have to hunt us up. Now, wait a minute, Call said. What's your horse brand, or do you have one? I have one. I brand Hick on the left hip. Are your horses shod? Call asked. All shod, Wilbarger said. Bring 'em if you see 'em. What's Hick stand for? Augustus asked. Well, it's Latin, Wilbarger said. Easier than what you wrote on that sign. Oh, Augustus said. Where'd you study Latin? Yale College, Wilbarger said. Then he and Chick trotted off. I'll figure he's a liar, Augustus said. A man like that went to Yale College, wouldn't need to trail cattle for a living. How do you know? Paul said. Maybe the family went broke. Maybe they just wanted an outdoor life. Augustus looked skeptical. It was a shock to think that there was someone in town more educated than himself. Caught you off, didn't he, Carl? You didn't even know what that short little word means. Why, it's short for hickoff, Augustus said lightly. It's a curious thing to brand on a horse, if you ask me. You figure Jake's drunk, Call asked. Why, no, Augustus said. I figure he's happier than he was this morning, though. Why? Because I want him sober tonight, Call said. I want you both sober. I could be as sober as the day I was born and not find no 100 horses, Augustus said. Those figures don't make sense. Wilburger needs 40, and we can't find that many anyway. What will we do with the other 60 if we was to find them? We need a remuda ourselves if we go to Montana, Call said. Augustus sat the jug down and sighed. I could kick, Jake, he said. Why? For putting that idea in your head. Jake's an easy fella. Ideas like that float right through his head and out the other side. But no darn idea has ever made it through your head. Your brain would bog a mule. Here I've been living in a warm climate most of my life, and you want me to move to a cold climate? Why not, if it's better country, Call asked. Augustus was silent for a time. I don't want to argue Montana right now, he said. I thought we were still arguing tonight. Where are we aiming to steal 100 horses? Hacienda Flores, Call said. I knowed it, Augustus said. We ain't going on a cow hunt, we're launching an assault. The Hacienda Flores was the largest ranch in Coahuila. It was there when the Rio Grande was just a river, not a boundary. The vaqueros would cross that river as casually as they crossed any stream. Millions of acres that had once been part of the hacienda were now part of Texas, but the vaqueros still crossed the river and brought back cattle and horses. They were, in their view, merely bringing back their own. The ranch headquarters was only 30 miles away, and it was there that they kept the main part of the horse herd, several hundred strong, with many of the horses wearing Texas brands. If I didn't know better, I'd say that you were trying to scare up a war, Augustus said.
Back to kill you.
Old Pedro Flores ain't gonna make us a gift of 100 horses, even if he did steal all of them himself. Everything's got its risks, Call said. Yeah, and you're as fond of risk as Jake is of women, Augustus said. Suppose we get away with the horses, what then? Sell Wilburger 40 and keep the rest, Call said. Pick up some cattle and head north. Head north? Who with? Augustus asked. We don't exactly add up to a cattle crew.
You'll pay for
We can
this.
hire cowboys, Call said. There's plenty of young cowhands around here. Augustus sighed again and stood up. It looked like the easy life was over for a while. Call had idled too long, and now he was ready to make up for it by working 6 times as hard as any human should work. On the other hand, it would be satisfying to run off some of Pedro's horses. Pedro was an old rival, and rivalry still had its interest.
I sure hope this ain't...
Jake would have done better to let them hang him. You know how he suffers when he has to work.
Is for you.
Now, where are you going? Call asked when Augustus started to walk off. Why, down to tell Jake the news. He might want to oil his gun. I guess we'll take the boy, Call said. He had been thinking about it. If they were going to get 100 horses, they would need every hand. Why, good, Augustus said. I'll tell Newt. He'll probably be so pleased he'll fall off the fence. But Newt wasn't sitting on a fence when he heard the news. He was standing in the sandy bottom of Hat Creek listening to Dish Bogat vomit. Dish was upstream a little ways, acting very sick, and he had come walking up from the saloon with Jake Spoon and Mr. Gus, not walking too straight, but on his feet. Then he had stumbled over the edge of the creek and started vomiting. Now he was down on his hands and knees, still vomiting. The sounds coming out of him reminded Newt of the sucking sound a cow makes pulling her foot out of a muddy bog. Newt had been sick at his stomach a few times, but never that sick, and he was worried. Dish sounded like he was going to die. Newt would not have thought anybody could get so sick in such a short space of time. Mr. Jake and Mr. Gus didn't seem worried, though. They stood on the banks of the creek, chatting amiably. while Dish hung his head and made the sound like the bogged cow. With Dish in such trouble, Newt could hardly enjoy the good news Mr. Gus had told him, though it was news he had waited for years. Instead of floating with happiness, he was too worried about Dish to feel much of anything else. "You want me to get Bolivar?" he asked. Bolivar was the house doctor. Mr. Gus shook his head. "Bolivar can't get a man over being drunk," he said. "Call should have kept you boys working. If Dish had stayed down in that well, he never would have been tempted." "A fish couldn't drink no faster than that boy drank," Jake said. "If fishes drink." "They don't drink what he drunk," Augustus said. He knew perfectly well that Dish had been love-smitten, and that had been his undoing. "I hope the captain don't see him," Newt said. The captain was intolerant of drinking unless it was done at night and in moderation. No sooner had he said it than he saw the captain come out of the house and walk toward them. Dish was still on his hands and knees. About that time, Bolivar began to beat the dinner bell with a crowbar, though it was much earlier than their usual supper hour. He had evidently not cleared his action with the captain, who looked around in annoyance. The clanging of iron on iron didn't do much to improve Dish's condition. He began to make the boggy sound again. Jake looked at Augustus. "Call's apt to fire him," he said. "Ain't there any excuses we can make for him?" "Dish Boget is a top hand," Augustus said. "He can make his own excuses." Call walked up and looked at the stricken cowboy, whose stomach was still heaving. "What happened to him?" he asked, frowning. "I didn't see it," Augustus said. "I think he may have swallowed a hunk of barbed wire." Dish, meanwhile, heard a new voice above him and turned his head enough to see that the captain had joined a group of spectators. It was an eventuality that he had been dreading, even in his sickness. He had no memory of what had happened in the dry bean, except that he had sung a lot of songs. But even in the depths of his drunkenness, he had realized that he would have to answer for it all to Captain Call. At some point, he had lost sight of Lorena, forgot he was in love with her, and even forgot that she was sitting across the room with Jake. But he never quite forgot that he was supposed to ride that night with Captain Call. In his mind's eye, he had seen them riding, even as he drank and sang. And now the captain had come, and it was time to begin to ride. Dish didn't know if he had the strength to stand up, much less mount a horse, much less stay aboard one and round up livestock. But he knew his reputation was at stake, and that if he didn't give it a try, he would be disgraced forever. His stomach had not quite quit heaving, but he managed to take a deep breath and get to his feet. He made a pretense of walking up the bank as if nothing was wrong, but his legs had no life in them, and he was forced to drop to his knees and crawl up, which only added embarrassment to his misery, the bank being scarcely 3 feet high and little more than a slope. Call stepped close enough to the young cowboy to smell whiskey and realized he was only sick drunk. It was the last thing he had expected, and his immediate impulse was to fire the boy on the spot and send him back to Shanghai Pierce, who was said to be tolerant of the bottle. But before he opened his mouth to do it, he happened to note that Gus and Jake were grinning at one another as if it were all a capital joke. To them, no doubt it was. Jokes had always interested them more than serious business. But since they were so full of this particular joke, it occurred to Call that they had probably tricked Dish somehow and got him drunk on purpose. In which case, it was not entirely the boys' fault. They were wily foxes and worse about joking when the two of them were together. It was just like them to pull such a stunt at the time when it was least appropriate. Just the kind of thing they had done all through the years as rangers. Dish, meanwhile, had gained the top of the bank and made it to his feet. When he stood up, his head cleared for a moment and he felt a wild optimism. Maybe he was over being drunk. A second later, his hopes were shattered. He started to walk off toward the lots to saddle his horse. He stubbed his toe on a mesquite root that poked up through the dirt and fell flat on his face. Newt's hopes had risen too when Dish stood up, and he was horribly embarrassed when his friend sprawled in the dirt. It was a mystery to him how Dish could get so drunk in such a short space of time, and why he would do it, with such an important night ahead. Bolivar was still banging the bell with a crowbar, making it that much more difficult. to think. Jake Spoon was unaccustomed to Bolivar's habits and grimaced
Been a while
unhappily
since
as
you
the
were through
banging
here.
continued.
All right, take a look.
Who asked
It's
that
worth
old man
buying?
to make
I'll
such a
buy it.
racket, he asked.
Very nice.
Why don't somebody shoot
Shame
him?
to part with it, I bet.
Yeah, if we shoot him, we'll have Gus for a cook. In that case, we'll have to eat talk, or else starve to death listening. You could do worse than to listen to me, Augustus said.
Do not leave it near
Dish
the
Bogat
campfire.
had risen again. His eyes had a wide, glassy look, and he held himself carefully, as if afraid that another fall would break him like glass.
Careful with those.
What happened to you? Call asked. Why, Captain, I wish I could say. Why can't you say? Because I can't remember, Dish said. Oh, he's all right, Augustus said. He just wanted to see how fast he could drink 2 bottles of whiskey. Who put him up to that? Call asked. Not me, Augustus said. Not me neither, Jake said, grinning. All I done was offer to hunt a funnel. I believe he could have gotten it down a little faster if he'd had a funnel. I can ride, Captain, Dish said. Once I get on a horse, it'll all wear off.
Gentle with that.
I hope you're right,
Trust
Call
me.
said. I'll not keep a man in my crew who can't do his job. Bolivar was still clanging the bell, which caused Jake to look more out of temper. Hell, if this is the 4th of July, I'll set off my own firecrackers, he said, taking out his pistol. Before anybody could say a word, he shot 3 times in the general direction of the house. The clanging continued as if the shots hadn't happened, but Newt, at least, was shocked. It seemed a reckless way to act, even if Bull was making too much noise. If you're that trigger-happy, no wonder you're on the run, Augustus said. If you want to stop the noise, go hit him in the head with a brick. Why walk when you can shoot? Jake asked with another grin. Call said nothing. He had noticed that Jake actually raised his barrel enough to eliminate any danger to their cook. It was typical. Jake always liked to act meaner than he was. If you men want grub, you better go get it, he said. Sundown would be the time to leave. After supper, Jake and Augustus went outside to smoke and spit. Dish sat on the Dutch oven, sipping black coffee and squeezing his temples with one hand. Each temple felt like someone had given it a sharp rap with a small axe. Dietz and Newt started for the lots to catch the horses. Newt very conscious of the fact that he was the only one in the group without a sidearm. Dietz had an old Walker Colt the size of a ham, which he only wore when he went out on trips, since even he wouldn't have been stout enough to carry it all day without wearing down. The captain had gone to the lots ahead of them, since it took a little time to get the hell bitch saddled. He had her snubbed to the post when Dietz and Newt arrived. When Newt walked in the barn to get a rope, the captain turned and handed him a holstered pistol and a gun belt. Better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it, he added, a little solemnly. Newt took the gun and slipped it out of its holster. It smelled faintly of oil. The captain must have oiled it that day. It was not the first time that he'd held a pistol, of course. Mr. Gus had given him thorough training in pistol shooting and had even complimented him on his skill. But holding one and actually having one of your own were 2 different things. He turned the cylinder of the Colt and listened to the small, clear clicks it made. The grip was wood, the barrel cool and blue. The holster had kept a faint smell of saddle soap. He slipped the gun back in its holster, put the gun belt around his waist, and felt the gun's solid weight against his hip. When he walked out into the lots to catch his horse, he felt grown and complete for the first time in his life. The sun was just easing down toward the western horizon, and the bull bass were dipping toward the stone stock tank that Dietz and the captain had built long ago. Dietz had already caught Mr. Gus's horse, a big solid sorrel they called Mud Pie, and he was catching his own mount. Newt shook out a loop and on the first throw caught his own favorite, a dun gelding named Mouse. He felt he could even rope better with a gun on his hip. Oh my, they done put a gun on you, ain't they, Dietz said with a big grin. I guess the next thing you'll be the boss of us all. No thought that ambitious had ever crossed Newt's mind. The summit of his hopes had been to be one of the crew, to be allowed to go along and do whatever there was to do. But Dietz said it as a joke, and Newt was in the perfect mood to take a joke. That's right, he said. I expect they'll make me boss any day. First thing I'll do is raise your wages. Dietz slapped his leg and laughed. The thought was so funny. When the rest of the outfit finally wandered down from the house, they found the two of them grinning back and forth at each other. "Look at them," Augustus said. "You'd think they just discovered teeth." As the day died and the afterglow stretched upward in the soft, empty sky, the Hat Creek outfit, 7 strong, crossed the river and rode southeast toward the Hacienda Flores.